Summer 1943, somewhere over the Solomon Islands. The radio crackled with static as Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare listened to intelligence reports from captured Japanese pilots. Their words, translated and relayed through Navy channels, contained a mixture of contempt and amusement. The Americans had developed a new carrier fighter, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, and Japanese aviators who had examined photographs and intelligence reports were laughing. The Hellcat was fat, they said, bloated, over-engineered and overweight. It looked like someone had strapped wings to a fuel tanker, where the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was elegant, svelte, and graceful. A ballerina of the skies, the Hellcat appeared brutish and clumsy. Japanese pilots, veterans of hundreds of combat hours gained in the opening 18 months of the Pacific War, genuinely believed the Americans had built an inferior fighter. They would maintain numerical superiority over this new American aircraft, just as they had dominated the F4F Wildcat, F2A Buffalo, and P-40 Warhawk in the early war years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They were catastrophically, fatally wrong. Within 6 months, the Hellcat would establish itself as the most lethal fighter aircraft in the Pacific theater. The fat fighter that Japanese pilots had mocked would destroy their aircraft at ratios approaching 19-1. Those 50 caliber machine guns they had dismissed would shred Zeros in seconds, tearing through their unarmored fuel tanks and unprotected pilots. The weight they had laughed at would save American pilots' lives, while Japanese aviators died in aircraft designed to sacrifice protection for performance. To understand the Hellcat's triumph, one must first appreciate the Zero's remarkable but ultimately flawed design philosophy. When the Mitsubishi A6M entered service in 1940, it represented a revolutionary achievement in aeronautical engineering. Chief designer Jiro Horikoshi had been given an impossible specification by the Imperial Japanese Navy: create a carrier-based fighter with performance superior to land-based fighters, exceptional range, outstanding maneuverability, and heavy armament. Horikoshi achieved this miracle through radical weight reduction. Every unnecessary gram was eliminated. The Zero's airframe used a newly developed aluminum alloy called extra superduralumin, which offered excellent strength-to-weight characteristics. The aircraft had no armor plate protecting the pilot. The fuel tanks were unprotected and non-self-sealing. Even the smallest structural components were designed to the absolute minimum specifications necessary for functionality. The result was extraordinary. The A6M Model 21, the variant that fought throughout 1942, weighed only 5,313 pounds fully loaded. It could achieve 331 miles per hour at 14,930 feet, exceptional performance for 1,941. Its range was phenomenal, 1,160 miles with drop tanks, allowing it to escort bombers to targets American planners believed impossible to reach. Its roll rate was good at high speeds and legendary at low speeds. It could outturn virtually any Allied fighter in service. Most importantly, the Zero possessed overwhelming firepower for its time. Two 20mm Type 99 cannons mounted in the wings provided devastating punch. Each cannon fired explosive shells that could destroy an enemy aircraft with a single well-placed hit. Two 7.7mm machine guns in the cowling, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, provided additional firepower for strafing and longer-range harassment. When the Pacific War began on the 7th of December 1941, Allied pilots encountered the Zero with shock and disbelief. The aircraft's combination of speed, range, and maneuverability seemed impossible. Early intelligence reports claiming the Zero could perform certain maneuvers were dismissed by Western engineers as exaggerations or lies. Then American and British pilots began dying in large numbers as these impossible aircraft outfought everything the Allies could put in the air. Over the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and the Netherlands East Indies, Zeros established air superiority so complete that Allied bomber crews referred to missions as suicide runs. At Darwin, Australia, Zeros destroyed 11 aircraft on the ground and shot down several defending fighters without losing a single aircraft. At Ceylon, they mauled Royal Air Force squadrons equipped with modern Hurricane fighters. In the skies over Java, they annihilated a mixed force of American, British, Dutch, and Australian aircraft. But the Zero's dominance rested on a foundation with fatal cracks that would widen catastrophically as the war progressed. The same weight reduction that gave the Zero its performance also made it vulnerable. The unarmored fuel tanks could be ignited by a single tracer round. The lack of pilot armor meant that even glancing hits could wound or kill the aviator. The lightweight structure could not absorb battle damage that sturdier aircraft would shrug off. More fundamentally, the Zero's design represented the culmination of pre-war fighter doctrine, emphasizing maneuverability and range over protection and firepower. This doctrine assumed that skilled pilots would avoid being hit through superior flying. It assumed that air combat would consist primarily of dogfights where agility mattered most. These assumptions proved increasingly invalid as the war evolved, and American aircraft designers developed fighters based on fundamentally different principles. Japanese pilots trained in this philosophy became complicit in their own vulnerability. The emphasis on offensive maneuverability and aggressive tactics left little room for defensive flying or survival techniques. Pilots were taught to close with the enemy and destroy them through superior skill and aircraft. Performance. The concept of breaking off combat to preserve the aircraft and pilot for future missions was seen as cowardice. This cultural attitude, combined with the Zero's vulnerability, created a death spiral where experienced pilots were lost at unsustainable rates. The American fighter development that led to the Hellcat began in defeat and humiliation. The F4F Wildcat, America's primary carrier fighter in 1942, was outclassed by the Zero in almost every performance metric. The Wildcat was slower by 50 miles per hour. It could not match the Zero's rate of climb. Its service ceiling was lower. It could not outturn the Zero at any altitude or speed. Yet Wildcat pilots survived and sometimes prevailed through tactics that would define American fighter doctrine for the remainder of the war. The Tash Weave, developed by Commander John S. Thatch of VF-3, allowed pairs of Wildcats to cover each other against Zero attacks through coordinated maneuvers. The tactic worked because the Wildcat, while slower and less maneuverable, was sturdier and possessed better high-speed handling characteristics. More importantly, American pilots learned never to dogfight Zeros. Instead, they used boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, making a high-speed firing pass, then using their superior diving speed to escape before the Zero could bring its maneuverability to bear. This approach required discipline and patience, but it worked because American aircraft could survive hits that would destroy Japanese fighters. These tactical lessons were being codified and distributed throughout Navy fighter squadrons, even as Grumman engineers were incorporating them into the Hellcats' design. After-action reports from Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal were analyzed in detail. Pilots rotated back to training commands brought first-hand combat experience. Intelligence officers compiled detailed assessments of Japanese tactics and aircraft capabilities. All of this information flowed to Grumman, where it influenced every design decision. The lessons were being absorbed by Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation even before Pearl Harbor. In June 1941, 6 months before war began, Grumman began design work on a new carrier fighter designated XF6F1. The project team, led by Chief Engineer William Schwendler and Project Engineer Bob Hall, incorporated everything the Navy had learned about air combat and everything they could discover about Japanese fighter capabilities. The initial design was conservative, essentially an enlarged and improved Wildcat, but in June 1942, a captured intact Zero was recovered from Akutan Island in Alaska after its pilot had crashed, attempting an emergency landing. The aircraft was shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, where it underwent exhaustive testing that would revolutionize American understanding of their enemy's capabilities. American test pilots flew the Zero extensively, pushing it to its limits and beyond. Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders conducted the initial test flights, reporting detailed observations that confirmed some suspicions and revealed new vulnerabilities. The Zero's phenomenal low-speed maneuverability was genuine. It could turn inside any American fighter below 200 miles per hour. But above 300 miles per hour, the tables turned dramatically. The Zero's ailerons became extremely heavy, making it difficult to roll quickly in high-speed combat. Its relatively low redline speed, the maximum speed beyond which structural failure became likely, was only 380 miles per hour, easily exceeded in a dive by American fighters with stronger airframes. Most critically, testing confirmed the Zero's vulnerability to gunfire. Test firings against captured Zero components demonstrated how easily the unprotected fuel tanks could be ignited. The lightweight structure buckled under impacts that American aircraft would absorb. Armor penetration tests showed that standard, .50 caliber ammunition would pass completely through the Zero's structure without encountering significant resistance. A Zero hit in a critical area was likely to be destroyed, while American aircraft with armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb significant damage and return home. This intelligence reached Grumman at the perfect moment. The XF6F1 prototype was still in testing, and substantial design changes remained possible. The project team made a series of crucial decisions that would define the Hellcat's character and determine its success. Rather than trying to match the Zero's maneuverability, they would build a fighter that could defeat the Zero using American tactical doctrine: speed, firepower, protection, and diving performance. The Grumman design philosophy for the Hellcat represented a complete rejection of the Zero's weight minimization approach. Instead of building the lightest possible airframe, Grumman built the most survivable fighter they could design while maintaining acceptable performance. The result was an aircraft that Japanese pilots would mock for its appearance but learn to fear for its capabilities. The F6F3, the initial production variant entering service in January 1943, weighed 12,186 pounds, fully loaded with ammunition and fuel, more than twice the weight of a Zero. This massive weight came from fundamental design choices, prioritizing pilot survival and combat effectiveness over theoretical performance. Every pound was there for a reason, and each added pound contributed to making the Hellcat the deadliest fighter in the Pacific. The pilot sat behind 212 pounds of armor plate. A thick slab of hardened steel protected his back and head from rear attacks. Bullet-resistant glass, 1.5 inches thick, protected him from frontal fire. The armor could stop 20mm cannon shells fired from typical combat ranges, though direct hits at close range could still penetrate. But most hits would strike at angles or ranges where the armor proved effective, and countless American pilots came home alive because steel plate absorbed bullets that would have killed them. The psychological benefit of this protection cannot be overstated. Pilots flying armored aircraft fought with confidence, knowing they could survive hits from behind. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics and willingness to press attacks. Zero pilots, knowing any hit could be fatal, increasingly flew defensively, constantly checking their 6 o'clock position, unable to focus completely on offensive operations. The armor's value extended beyond physical protection. It provided psychological security that enhanced combat effectiveness. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, a technology the Japanese never successfully implemented despite knowing about it. Each tank was lined with layers of rubber compound that would swell when exposed to fuel, automatically sealing bullet holes and preventing leakage. The system added weight and slightly reduced internal fuel capacity, but it meant that Hellcats could take multiple hits in the fuel system and continue fighting. Zeros hit in the fuel tanks typically caught fire and fell from the sky within seconds. American pilots who returned to carriers with dozens of bullet holes in their fuel tanks, still flying normally, provided living testament to the technology's effectiveness. The airframe itself was massively overbuilt compared to the Zero. Grumman, known in the Navy as the Grumman Iron Works for its rugged aircraft, designed the Hellcat with structural strength far beyond minimum requirements. The wings could absorb battle damage that would have torn a Zero apart. The fuselage could survive crashes that would have been fatal in lighter aircraft. Pilots returning with extensive damage would report that their aircraft felt like it was carved from a solid block of iron. This reputation for toughness boosted pilot morale and encouraged aggressive tactics. Pilots knew their aircraft could take punishment and bring them home. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Power came from the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that would become legendary as one of the finest piston engines ever built. The R2800 produced 2,000 horsepower, more than twice the output of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, producing 940 horsepower. This enormous power plant weighed 2,360 pounds, nearly half the entire weight of a Zero, but it gave the Hellcat performance that initially seemed impossible for such a heavy aircraft. The R2800 was also remarkably reliable. Its 2 rows of 9 cylinders provided redundancy. The engine could lose several cylinders and continue operating. Its robust construction tolerated battle damage that would have destroyed less substantial power plants. Mechanics loved it because it was easy to maintain and rarely failed. Pilots loved it because it started reliably, ran smoothly, and provided consistent power throughout the flight envelope. The engine's reliability meant that mechanical failures rarely caused losses, allowing operations tempo to remain high. Maximum speed was 376 miles per hour, at 17,300 feet 45 miles per hour faster than the Zero, despite weighing more than twice as much. Rate of climb was 3,410 feet per minute, superior to the Zero at all altitudes above 10,000 feet. Service ceiling was 37,300 feet, allowing Hellcat pilots to control the vertical dimension of combat. The aircraft could dive at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour without structural failure, while Zeros that exceeded 380 miles per hour risked shedding wings or tail surfaces. Most importantly for combat effectiveness, the Hellcat's controls remained responsive at high speeds. Unlike the Zero, whose ailerons became heavy and unresponsive above 230 miles per hour, the Hellcat could roll quickly at speeds above 300 miles per hour. This characteristic allowed American pilots to execute boom and zoom tactics effectively, diving, to attack, and then rolling away before the Japanese could respond. The high-speed handling made the Hellcat forgiving and predictable, allowing pilots to focus on combat rather than fighting their aircraft. The landing gear was another Grumman innovation that contributed significantly to the Hellcat's success. The wide-track main gear retracted inward into the wings, providing excellent stability during carrier landings. The robust design could absorb hard landings that would have collapsed weaker landing gear. For pilots operating from pitching carrier decks in rough seas, often at night or with battle damage, the forgiving landing characteristics saved countless lives. Many damaged Hellcats made carrier landings that would have been impossible in less robust aircraft. The Hellcat's primary armament consisted of 6 .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing. Japanese pilots initially dismissed this armament as inferior to the Zero's combination of cannons and machine guns. They were catastrophically mistaken. The 6-gun battery would prove to be one of the most effective fighter armaments of World War II. The .50 caliber M2 Browning was one of the finest weapons of World War II. Designed by John Browning and introduced in 1933, it fired a 45.4-gram projectile at 2,910 feet per second. Each gun had a cyclic rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute. With 6 guns firing simultaneously, the Hellcat could put approximately 80 rounds per second into a target area, a sustained stream of heavy projectiles that could destroy any Japanese aircraft in seconds. The ammunition mix was critical. Standard combat loads included armor-piercing incendiary (API) rounds, armor-piercing AP rounds, and tracer rounds in ratios that varied by squadron and mission. API rounds combined armor penetration with incendiary effects, igniting fuel when they penetrated tanks. The incendiary compound within the projectile ignited on impact, creating temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Against the Zero's unprotected fuel system, API rounds were devastating. A single hit to a fuel tank could ignite the aircraft within seconds. Armor-piercing rounds used hardened steel cores to penetrate armor plate and structural components. While Japanese aircraft lacked armor, the AP rounds were effective against engines, control surfaces, and structural members. Tracer rounds, loaded approximately every fifth round, allowed pilots to walk their fire onto target, correcting their aim in real time. The bright pyrotechnic compound burning in the tracer base created a visible trajectory, allowing pilots to see where their bullets were going and adjust their aim accordingly. Against the Zero's unprotected structure, this firepower was devastating. A 1-second burst, approximately 80 rounds hitting the target, could shred a Zero's wing, ignite its fuel tanks, kill the pilot, or destroy its engine. Hellcat pilots quickly learned that they didn't need to achieve the long, sustained bursts that might be necessary against armored targets. Short, accurate bursts were sufficient to destroy Zeros, and the 6-gun battery had enough ammunition for approximately 27 seconds of continuous fire. Though pilots rarely fired for more than 2 to 3 seconds at a time, each gun carried 400 rounds, providing 2,400 rounds total. This generous ammunition load meant pilots could engage multiple targets without worrying about running out of ammunition. In contrast, the Zero's 20mm cannons carried only 60 rounds per gun, 120 rounds total. A Zero pilot who missed with his initial attacks quickly found himself out of cannon ammunition, reduced to using his 7.7mm machine guns, which were largely ineffective against American armored aircraft. The Hellcat pilot could afford to take multiple shots at difficult targets, learning and adjusting with each pass. The wing-mounted installation provided excellent convergence patterns. The guns were, and harmonized, aimed to converge at approximately 1,000 feet. At this range, all 6 guns would concentrate their fire on a narrow area, about 3 feet in diameter. Any aircraft caught in this cone of fire would be subjected to overwhelming destructive force. The convergence pattern was carefully calculated. Too close and the bullets would converge beyond typical combat ranges. Too far and the pattern would be too dispersed at close range. The 1,000-foot convergence proved optimal for Pacific combat conditions. Moreover, the .50 caliber weapons proved remarkably reliable in combat conditions. Unlike the Zero's 20mm cannons, which were prone to jamming and required careful maintenance, the Brownings rarely malfunctioned. The weapons were designed with wide tolerances that allowed them to function despite dirt, moisture, and battle damage. They operated reliably at high altitudes where temperatures dropped below freezing. They continued firing despite exposure to salt spray and humidity in the tropical maritime environment. The reliability factor cannot be overstated in aerial combat. A weapon that fails to fire at the critical moment transforms a potential victory into possible defeat or death. Hellcat pilots knew their guns would work when they pressed the trigger. This confidence allowed them to focus on tactics and marksmanship rather than worrying about mechanical failures. Zero pilots, in contrast, frequently experienced cannon jams that left them defenseless at critical moments. Japanese aviators who survived encounters with Hellcats consistently reported the terrifying effectiveness of the 6-gun battery. One Japanese pilot, interviewed after the war, described being hit by a Hellcat. "I saw the tracers reaching toward me like fingers of death. Then my aircraft seemed to explode around me. In 1 second, perhaps 2, my Zero transformed from a fighting machine into a falling wreck. I never saw another aircraft that could destroy a plane so quickly. The sound was horrible, like someone tearing apart a tin can. Then, fire, everywhere fire, and I was falling." Another survivor described the psychological impact. When you saw a Hellcat turning toward you, you knew you had perhaps 2 or 3 seconds to evade before those 6 guns opened fire. If you were slow, if you hesitated, you were dead. I saw so many comrades die this way, one moment flying normally, the next moment their aircraft coming apart, burning, falling. After seeing this happen repeatedly, it became difficult to maintain offensive spirit. We began flying to survive rather than to kill. The F6F Hellcat entered combat with VF-5 aboard USS Yorktown, CV-10, during the Marcus Island raid on the 31st of August 1943. The initial results were promising but not dramatic. VF-5 claimed 21 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of 1 Hellcat, but these early engagements involved small numbers of aircraft and provided limited data about the Hellcat's true capabilities. The pilots returning from these initial missions reported enthusiastically about the new fighter's characteristics. The speed was impressive. They could catch or escape from any Japanese aircraft. The climb rate allowed them to gain altitude advantage quickly. The guns were devastating. Short bursts destroyed targets that would have required sustained fire from Wildcats. Most importantly, pilots hit by Japanese fire were surviving and returning to the carrier, their armor and self-sealing tanks protecting them from damage that would have been fatal in earlier fighters. The true test came during Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa and Makin atolls in November 1943. 9 carrier air groups, operating over 100 Hellcats, provided air support and combat air patrol during the amphibious landings. Japanese aircraft from bases in the Marshall Islands attempted to strike the American carriers in coordinated attacks that should have tested the new fighter's capabilities thoroughly. The resulting air battles provided conclusive evidence of the Hellcat's superiority. During the 4 days of major air combat from November 19 to 23, Hellcat pilots claimed 120 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of 25 Hellcats, a kill ratio approaching 5-1. More importantly, the majority of lost Hellcats fell to anti-aircraft fire from American ships in the confusion of combat, not to Japanese fighters. The actual air-to-air kill ratio was closer to 10-1, a stunning achievement that shocked even optimistic Navy planners. Lieutenant Yeji Alexander Vratsiu of VF-6, flying from USS Intrepid, recorded his impressions of his first large-scale combat in the Hellcat. The Zero pilots still tried to dogfight us. They would turn tight, expecting us to follow and overshoot. But we had learned. I would dive through the formation, pick a target, fire a burst, and then zoom climb away using my superior speed and power. The Zeros couldn't follow. When they tried to climb after me, their speed bled off, and they became sitting ducks. I could loop over the top and dive back down for another pass. It was almost unfair. They were fighting 1942's war with 1942's tactics, and we were fighting 1943's war with an aircraft designed specifically to defeat them. The pattern established at Tarawa would repeat throughout 1944 and 1945 as American carriers ranged across the Pacific. During the January 1944 strikes on Truk, the supposedly impregnable Japanese naval base in the Caroline Islands, Hellcats decimated the defending fighters. Over 250 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, most caught on the ground, but air-to-air combat produced a kill ratio approaching 15, 1 in favor of American pilots. The base that had been Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific was neutralized in 2 days, with Hellcats providing the shield that allowed American bombers to operate freely. By early 1944, Japanese intelligence had compiled detailed reports on the Hellcats' characteristics and capabilities. These reports were distributed to fighter units throughout the Pacific, accompanied by new tactical instructions emphasizing survival over aggressive engagement. Japanese pilots were instructed to avoid direct combat with Hellcats when possible, to attack only when holding decisive advantage, and to break off engagements if Hellcats intervened. These defensive instructions represented a complete reversal of earlier Japanese fighter doctrine and demonstrated how thoroughly the Hellcat had seized the initiative. The Hellcat's finest hour came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19 to 21,944. The engagement, known irreverently to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, represented the death of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force and provided the most dramatic demonstration of the Hellcats' overwhelming superiority. The Japanese mobile fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, sortied to destroy the American carrier force supporting the invasion of Saipan. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers with approximately 430 aircraft, including 222 A6M Zero fighters and an assortment of modern dive bombers and torpedo planes. He faced Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 58, with 15 carriers operating approximately 475 F6F Hellcats, along with dive bombers and torpedo planes. On paper, the forces appeared relatively balanced. On June 19, Ozawa launched 4 major strikes totaling over 300 aircraft against the American fleet. What followed was systematic slaughter that would haunt Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. Hellcat pilots, guided to their targets by sophisticated fighter direction officers using radar, intercepted the Japanese formations far from the carriers. The resulting combats were completely one-sided, with Japanese formations being torn apart before they could reach their targets. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, now flying from USS Lexington, achieved ace-in-a-day status by shooting down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8. His post-flight debriefing captured the lopsided nature of the combat. I spotted a large formation of Judy's Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers, with 0 escorts at about 16,000 feet. I dove through the escorts they scattered when they saw us coming and got on the tail of a Judy. One burst and he exploded, then another, same result, and another. The Zeros didn't even try to engage us, they were just trying to survive. I went through that formation like a bowling ball through pins. It wasn't combat, it was execution. Commander David McCampbell, leading VF-15 from USS Essex, shot down 7 aircraft in a single engagement, bringing his total to 19 victories. His report emphasized the complete breakdown of Japanese tactical coordination. They flew in ragged formations with no mutual support. When we hit them, they scattered individually with no coordinated defense. It was like shooting ducks in a barrel. Our pilots were calm, methodical, executing textbook attacks against targets that seemed unable to fight back effectively. I've never seen such one-sided combat. By day's end, American pilots claimed approximately 380 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Post-war analysis suggests the actual figure was closer to 330, still a devastating loss representing nearly 75% of Ozawa's air strength. Of these, approximately 240 fell to Hellcats in air-to-air combat. American losses totaled 30 aircraft, including 10 Hellcats lost in combat. The kill ratio exceeded 15-1, and if only air-to-air losses are counted, it approached 24-1, the most lopsided air battle of the Pacific War. The battle destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force. The mobile fleet survived with most of its carriers intact, but they had lost irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. Japanese carriers would sortie once more during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, but only as decoys with token air groups. The Hellcat had accomplished in one day what had seemed impossible 2 years, earlier absolute air superiority over the Japanese throughout the Central Pacific. Japanese survivors of the battle provided sobering testimony about the experience. One Zero pilot, rescued after ditching, described the engagement. We approached the American fleet, expecting to find perhaps 2 or 3 carriers with fighter protection. Instead, we found what seemed like an entire nation's air force waiting for us. Hellcats came from every direction above, below, from the sides. We could not evade them. We could not outrun them. We could not fight them effectively. Within minutes, our formation was destroyed. I saw aircraft exploding all around me, pilots dying without even firing their weapons. I survived only because I dove away immediately and flew at wave-top height back toward our fleet. I felt cowardly, but I knew that staying meant certain death. The Hellcat's extraordinary success resulted from the synthesis of superior technology with mature tactical doctrine. The aircraft itself provided advantages that skilled pilots could exploit ruthlessly. The tactical doctrine ensured those advantages were employed to maximum effect. Neither element alone would have achieved the results that the combination produced. The weight that Japanese pilots had mocked proved decisive in combat. The armor that saved American pilots' lives allowed experienced aviators to survive and accumulate combat hours. A Zero pilot hit once usually died. His experience died with him. The Hellcat pilot hit once or twice usually survived, learned from the experience, and became more deadly. This created a virtuous cycle where American pilot quality improved continuously, while Japanese pilot quality degraded as veterans were killed and replaced by inadequately trained newcomers. By mid-1944, the average American carrier pilot had over 600 hours of flight training and 100+ hours of combat experience. The average Japanese pilot had perhaps 300 hours of training and was flying his first or second combat mission. This experience gap, made possible by the Hellcat's protective features, proved as important as any performance advantage. Experienced pilots made fewer mistakes, scored more kills, and survived longer, creating an exponentially widening capability gap. The self-sealing fuel tanks that added weight prevented the catastrophic fires that consumed Zeros when hit in the fuel system. American pilots could take hits and continue fighting. Japanese pilots who took similar hits usually died in flames within seconds. The psychological impact of this difference cannot be overstated. American pilots fought knowing they could survive hits, while Japanese pilots fought knowing any hit to their fuel system meant death. This psychological advantage translated into more aggressive tactics and better combat performance. The powerful engine that contributed to the Hellcat's weight provided superior speed and climb rate. These performance advantages allowed American pilots to control the terms of engagement. They could choose when to fight and when to disengage. Zero pilots, flying slower aircraft, could not force engagement against unwilling Hellcat pilots and could not escape when American pilots initiated combat. This control of engagement terms meant Hellcat pilots fought only when conditions favored them. The 6.50 caliber machine guns provided overwhelming firepower against unprotected targets. The reliable weapons, massive ammunition load, and concentrated fire pattern allowed Hellcat pilots to destroy Zeros in seconds. Japanese cannon-armed fighters theoretically delivered more destructive power per hit, but in practice, the Browning's reliability and ammunition capacity proved more effective. A Japanese pilot who ran out of cannon ammunition was effectively defenseless, while Hellcat pilots rarely exhausted their ammunition supplies. Beyond the aircraft itself, American tactical doctrine maximized the Hellcat's advantages while minimizing its weaknesses. Pilots were instructed never to dogfight Zeros, the one area where the Japanese aircraft retained superiority. Instead, they used boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude to attack and then climbing away using superior speed and power. These tactics required discipline, but they worked devastatingly well. Japanese pilots trained to dogfight found themselves unable to bring their greatest advantage to bear against American pilots who refused to engage on Japanese terms. American fighter direction officers, using shipboard radar, guided Hellcat formations to intercept incoming Japanese attacks at maximum range. This allowed American fighters to gain altitude advantage before engaging, further increasing their tactical superiority. Japanese formations, lacking comparable radar and fighter direction capabilities, often flew into ambushes with American fighters diving on them from above. The information advantage provided by radar proved as valuable as the Hellcat's performance advantages. The emphasis on teamwork reinforced the Hellcat's advantages. American pilots flew in mutually supporting pairs and divisions, using the thach-weave and other coordinated tactics to protect each other. Japanese pilots, trained in individual combat and increasingly flying solo as their numbers dwindled, could not coordinate effectively against organized American formations. A lone Zero attacking a Hellcat division faced coordinated defense from multiple aircraft, while a Hellcat attacking a Japanese formation received immediate support from wingmen. The Hellcat served throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, from its combat debut in August 1943 through the Japanese surrender in August 1945. It participated in every major carrier operation, from the Gilberts to Okinawa, destroying Japanese aircraft wherever it encountered them. Total production reached 12,275 aircraft, and these aircraft destroyed approximately 5,000 223 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat more than any other Allied fighter, and nearly 75% of all enemy aircraft destroyed by American carrier aviation. By war's end, Japanese pilots who survived to encounter Hellcats learned to respect and fear the fat fighter they had initially mocked. Captured Japanese aviators consistently described the Hellcat as the most formidable opponent they faced. One pilot, interviewed after the war, provided a telling assessment. "We called it the strongest fighter in the sky. Not the fastest or most maneuverable we knew. The F4U Corsair was faster, and our own Key 84 Frank was more maneuverable. But strongest, most difficult to kill, most deadly when it attacked, that was the Hellcat. If I saw a formation of Hellcats, I knew my chance of survival was small. They were too well protected, too well armed, and their pilots were too skilled. Fighting Hellcats was not combat, it was survival." The aircraft that Japanese pilots had laughed at became the instrument of their defeat. The weight they had mocked saved American lives by the thousands. The armor plate that made the Hellcat fat stopped bullets and cannon shells that would have killed unprotected pilots. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the catastrophic fires that consumed lightly built Japanese aircraft. The powerful engine provided the speed and climb performance that allowed American pilots to control the terms of combat. The 6.50 caliber machine guns, delivering overwhelming firepower from reliable, well-supplied weapons, destroyed enemy aircraft in seconds. Short, accurate bursts shredded Zeros, setting their unprotected fuel tanks ablaze and killing their unarmored pilots. The destructive power of those 6 guns, concentrated in a small area through careful harmonization, proved decisive in combat after combat. Japanese pilots who survived Hellcat attacks spoke with horror about the devastating effect of the 6-gun battery. The Hellcat represented a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy, where the Zero emphasized performance through weight reduction, accepting vulnerability as the price of maneuverability. The Hellcat prioritized survivability and firepower, accepting greater weight as the price of protection. In the crucible of combat, the American approach proved superior. The lessons learned from thousands of combat engagements validated the design philosophy. Protecting the pilot and providing overwhelming firepower produced better results than maximizing maneuverability at the expense of protection. The lessons learned from the Hellcat's success influenced fighter design for decades. Modern fighters incorporate armor, redundant systems, and survivability features that descend directly from the philosophy Grumman pioneered. The principle that protecting the pilot is as important as providing performance has become fundamental to fighter design. The F-15 Eagle's mantra, "not a pound for air to ground," echoes the Hellcat's prioritization of air superiority performance, while its structural strength and survivability features directly reflect lessons learned from the Hellcat's success. For the thousands of American pilots who flew the Hellcat in combat, the aircraft represented more than engineering excellence. It represented the difference between life and death. Pilots who took hits and came home alive understood viscerally that the armor plate behind their seats, the self-sealing fuel tanks beneath them, and the rugged airframe around them were the reasons they survived to fight another day. Many pilots credited the Hellcat with saving their lives, some multiple times during their combat tours. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 victories, all scored in Hellcats, provided the ultimate tribute. "The Hellcat was the finest fighter aircraft I ever flew. It was fast, it was strong, it was deadly. It brought me home when other aircraft would have failed. It gave me the confidence to press attacks that would have been suicidal in lesser fighters. Every kill I scored, every mission I completed, every time I came home alive I owed to that magnificent aircraft. It was more than a weapon, it was a partner in survival." In the end, the fat fighter proved that weight, properly distributed and purposefully employed, could be strength rather than weakness. The Hellcat that Japanese pilots had mocked became their nemesis, establishing American air superiority across the Pacific and contributing decisively to Allied victory. When Japanese carrier pilots laughed at the Hellcat's weight, they laughed at the engineering choices that would destroy them. Within months, the laughter stopped. The 6 .50 caliber machine guns had spoken their final verdict, written in the wreckage of Japanese aircraft scattered across the Pacific from the Solomons to the home islands. The weight that saved American lives had crushed Japanese ambitions, and the mockery had transformed into respect born of bitter experience and devastating loss. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.